In 2015, a woman rancher from rural Montana vanished without a trace while driving cattle across her family's vast property, leaving behind only her abandoned truck and a community filled with unanswered questions. But 9 years later, an oil drilling crew would strike something metallic buried deep underground, a discovery that would shatter everything her daughter thought she knew about that terrible day. Rebecca Crawford sat in the passenger seat of the dusty pickup truck, watching the familiar landscape of the Crawford Ranch roll by through the window. The September morning air carried the scent of dry grass and distant wildfire smoke, a smell that always reminded her of home, though she hadn't lived here in nearly a decade. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the folder in her lap, filled with legal documents that would soon transfer ownership of the 15,000-acre property to an oil company. The drilling equipment ahead grew larger as they approached, massive steel structures rising against the endless Montana sky like mechanical giants. Rebecca had fought this decision for months, but the mounting debts and years of struggling to maintain the ranch alone had finally worn her down. Her mother Elizabeth, known to everyone as Beth, would have hated seeing strangers on their land, but Beth had been gone for 9 years now, disappeared without explanation on a crisp October morning in 2015. Rebecca was only 19 when it happened, a college sophomore studying veterinary medicine at Montana State University. She had planned to return home after graduation, to work alongside her mother caring for the cattle and horses that had been the Whitmore family legacy for 4 generations. Instead, she found herself thrust into a nightmare of police investigations, search parties, and endless questions with no satisfying answers. The pickup truck came to a stop near the drilling site, and Rebecca stepped out onto the familiar ground where she had spent countless childhood summers learning to rope cattle and mend fences. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now here to sign away everything her family had built, everything her mother had loved and protected with fierce determination. The foreman, a weathered man in his 50s named Tom Bradley, approached with a clipboard and a sympathetic expression. Bradley had been understanding about the family's tragic history when the oil company first approached about mineral rights. He knew about Beth Whitmore's disappearance, how the local community had spent weeks searching every gulch and canyon within 50 miles of the ranch. The official theory had always been that Beth suffered some kind of accident while driving cattle, possibly thrown from her horse in a remote area where her body simply hadn't been found. The vastness of the Montana wilderness could swallow a person completely, leaving no trace for searchers to follow. Rebecca signed the papers with a heavy heart, thinking about her mother's fierce independence and love for this land. Beth had been only 42 when she vanished, a woman in her prime who could handle a horse better than most men and had never shown fear of the isolation that came with ranch life. She had been driving a small herd of cattle from the south pasture to higher ground before winter, a routine task she had performed hundreds of times over the years. Her horse had returned to the barn that evening without her, and her truck was found abandoned on a dirt road 3 miles from the house, keys still in the ignition. The drilling began within hours of the paperwork being completed, massive augers biting into the earth that had belonged to the Whitmore family since 1889. Rebecca stayed to watch, partly out of morbid curiosity and partly because she couldn't bear to leave just yet. The sound of the machinery echoed across the rolling hills where she had learned to ride before she could properly walk, where her mother had taught her to read the weather and understand the rhythms of cattle and land. As the afternoon wore on, Rebecca found herself remembering the last conversation she had with her mother, a phone call from her college dorm room just 2 days before Beth disappeared. They had talked about Rebecca's upcoming midterm exams, about the cattle market, and about plans for Thanksgiving break. Beth had sounded tired but not worried, mentioning that Jake Morrison, their longtime ranch hand, had been helping with the fall roundup. There had been nothing in her voice to suggest that anything was wrong, no hint of the mystery that would soon engulf their family. The memory was interrupted by a sudden change in the drilling equipment's rhythm, a grinding sound that made Tom Bradley frown and signal for the crew to shut down the machinery. Rebecca watched as several workers gathered around the drill site, their voices carrying an urgent tone that made her stomach tighten with an inexplicable sense of dread. Tom Bradley pulled off his hard hat and wiped the sweat from his forehead as he knelt beside the drilling equipment, examining the twisted metal bit that had just been extracted from 40 feet below ground. The steel auger showed clear signs of impact damage, deep gouges and bent edges that could only come from striking something solid and unyielding buried in the earth. Rebecca approached the small group of workers, her heart pounding with a mixture of curiosity and growing unease. The drill operator, a young man named Carlos, shook his head as he inspected the damaged equipment. He explained to Bradley that the resistance had been sudden and complete, like hitting bedrock, except the geological surveys had shown nothing but clay and sediment at this depth. The grinding sound they had all heard was the drill bit destroying itself against whatever lay hidden beneath the surface of the Crawford Ranch. Bradley's expression grew more serious as he considered the implications. Oil drilling operations were expensive, and any significant delay could cost the company thousands of dollars per day. He had dealt with underground obstacles before, abandoned farm equipment or forgotten septic systems that previous landowners had failed to disclose. But this felt different somehow, the way the drill had stopped so abruptly, the metallic shriek that had echoed across the countryside just before the machinery shut down. Rebecca found herself thinking about her mother's disappearance as she watched the crew prepare a smaller exploration drill to investigate what lay below. Beth had vanished somewhere on this very property, her body never found despite extensive searches by law enforcement and volunteer teams. The official investigation had concluded that she likely suffered an accident in one of the remote canyons that cut through the ranch, areas too dangerous for searchers to explore thoroughly. Sheriff David Hayes had been a young deputy back in 2015, but he had recently taken over as the county's top law enforcement officer. Rebecca remembered him as thorough and compassionate during those terrible first weeks after her mother's disappearance. He had spent countless hours coordinating search efforts, interviewing potential witnesses, and following up on every possible lead. Hayes had been the one to deliver the devastating news that the official search would have to be called off after 3 weeks with no trace of Beth found. The exploration drill penetrated the earth more carefully this time, designed to create a narrow shaft that would allow them to lower a camera and examine whatever had damaged the original drilling equipment. Bradley explained the process to Rebecca as they waited, how the camera would transmit images back to a monitor, giving them a clear view of the underground obstacle without risking more expensive equipment. As the smaller drill worked its way down through the layers of soil and clay, Rebecca found her thoughts drifting to Jake Morrison, the ranch hand who had been working for her family since she was a child. Jake had been one of the last people to see her mother alive, helping her load feed supplements into the truck on the morning she disappeared. He had told investigators that Beth seemed normal that day, focused on the task of moving cattle but not unusually worried or distressed about anything. Jake had left the Crawford Ranch shortly after Beth's disappearance, claiming that working there without her felt too painful and strange. He had given Rebecca an awkward goodbye hug and promised to stay in touch, but she had heard from him only once in the years since, a brief condolence card sent on the first anniversary of her mother's vanishing. His sudden departure had always struck Rebecca as odd, given how devoted he had seemed to both Beth and the ranch itself. The exploration drill reached the target depth, and Bradley signaled for the camera to be lowered into the narrow shaft. Rebecca watched the monitor screen as the lens descended through darkness, the LED lights attached to the camera casting an eerie glow on the earthen walls of the hole. At 38 feet, the camera's view suddenly changed, revealing a large flat surface that reflected the lights with the unmistakable gleam of painted metal. Carlos whistled softly as he adjusted the camera's position, trying to get a better view of what they had found. The object appeared to be substantial, much larger than any piece of farm equipment that might have been buried and forgotten. Bradley's expression grew increasingly troubled as he studied the images, the painted surface clearly visible despite being covered with nearly 4 decades of accumulated soil and sediment. Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine as she stared at the monitor, watching the camera reveal more details of the buried object. The metal surface showed signs of impact damage, dents and scratches that suggested violence rather than careful burial. Most disturbing of all, the camera picked up what appeared to be glass fragments scattered around the object, pieces that caught and reflected the light like broken windows or headlights. Bradley made the decision to stop the exploration immediately and contact local law enforcement. He had seen enough suspicious discoveries during his career to recognize when a situation required official investigation rather than continued drilling. Rebecca agreed completely, her mind racing with possibilities she didn't want to consider, connections she hoped were purely coincidental. As Bradley placed the call to the sheriff's office, Rebecca walked away from the drilling site and stood looking out across the vast expanse of the Crawford Ranch. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills where her mother had spent the last morning of her life. Somewhere beneath her feet, buried deeper than anyone had thought to look, lay evidence that might finally provide answers to questions that had haunted her family for nearly a decade. Sheriff David Hayes arrived at the Crawford Ranch within an hour of Bradley's phone call, his patrol car kicking up a cloud of dust as it approached the drilling site. Rebecca watched him step out of the vehicle, noting how the years had changed him from the young deputy she remembered. His hair showed streaks of gray now, and deep lines around his eyes spoke of countless difficult cases and sleepless nights. But his manner remained the same, calm and methodical as he surveyed the scene before him. Hayes greeted Rebecca with a sympathetic nod, acknowledging the painful irony of his return to the ranch where her mother had vanished. He had always felt personally invested in Beth Whitmore's case, frustrated by the lack of concrete evidence and the way the investigation had eventually stalled. The official file remained open, but with no new leads emerging over the years, it had become one of those cold cases that haunted law enforcement officers long after active investigation ceased. Bradley explained the situation to Hayes, showing him the damaged drilling equipment and the images captured by the underground camera. The sheriff studied the monitor screen with growing interest, his trained eye picking up details that might be significant. The size and shape of the buried object, the way the metal surface reflected light, and especially the scattered glass fragments all pointed toward something far more substantial than abandoned farm equipment. Hayes made several phone calls, arranging for specialized equipment and personnel to be brought to the site. The Montana State Police had access to ground-penetrating radar and forensic archaeology teams that could carefully excavate whatever lay buried beneath the Crawford Ranch. He explained to Rebecca that the process would take time, possibly several days, but that preserving potential evidence was more important than speed. As they waited for the additional resources to arrive, Hayes walked Rebecca through what she remembered about the days leading up to her mother's disappearance. They sat in the shade of Bradley's trailer, away from the noise and activity of the drilling crew, and Hayes took careful notes as Rebecca recalled details she hadn't thought about in years. The conversation brought back painful memories, but also a sense of hope that answers might finally be within reach. Rebecca told Hayes about her mother's routine that final week, how Beth had been preparing for the seasonal cattle drive that would move the herd to winter pastures. The work was demanding but familiar, something Beth had done every autumn since taking over management of the ranch from her own father. There had been nothing unusual about her plans or her behavior, no indication that she expected any kind of trouble. The sheriff asked about Jake Morrison, the ranch hand who had been working for the family during that period. Rebecca explained how Jake had been hired 3 years before her mother's disappearance, coming to them with excellent references from other ranches in the area. He had been reliable and hardworking, earning Beth's trust and Rebecca's affection during her visits home from college. His sudden departure after Beth vanished had struck everyone as strange, but not necessarily suspicious. Hayes made a note to locate Jake Morrison and conduct a follow-up interview, something that should have been done more thoroughly during the original investigation. The passage of 9 years meant that memories might be less reliable, but it also meant that people might be more willing to share information they had previously kept to themselves. Cold cases sometimes broke when witnesses finally decided to speak up about things they had seen or suspected. The ground-penetrating radar equipment arrived late in the afternoon, operated by a team of technicians from the state crime lab. Rebecca watched as they set up the sophisticated machinery, designed to create detailed images of underground structures without disturbing potential evidence. The radar would be able to map the exact size and shape of the buried object, providing crucial information before any excavation began. The initial radar sweep confirmed what the camera had suggested: a large metallic object roughly the size and shape of a pickup truck, buried at a depth of 38 feet. The technicians also detected what appeared to be a second, smaller object nearby, possibly explaining some of the glass fragments visible on the camera footage. Hayes studied the radar images with growing concern, recognizing patterns that were all too familiar from previous investigations. As the sun began to set over the Montana landscape, Hayes made the decision to establish a formal crime scene perimeter around the drilling site. Yellow tape was strung between metal stakes, creating a boundary that would keep unauthorized personnel away from the area. Rebecca felt a chill as she watched the familiar ritual, remembering how similar tape had cordoned off areas of the ranch during the search for her mother 9 years earlier. The sheriff arranged for a security guard to watch the site overnight, ensuring that the potential evidence would remain undisturbed until excavation could begin. He explained to Rebecca that the process would likely take several days, with forensic archaeologists carefully removing soil layer by layer to preserve any evidence that might be present. The work would be painstaking and methodical, but it offered the best chance of finding answers that had eluded investigators for nearly a decade. Rebecca drove home to the ranch house that evening with her mind racing, unable to shake the feeling that her family's long nightmare might finally be approaching its end. The empty house felt different somehow, charged with the possibility that Beth's fate might soon be revealed. She called her aunt in Billings, the only remaining family member who had stayed in contact, and explained what had been discovered on the property. The conversation was difficult, bringing up emotions that both women had tried to bury over the years. Rebecca's aunt had always suspected that Beth's disappearance was not the simple accident that investigators had theorized. She had never understood how an experienced rancher like Beth could simply vanish without a trace, leaving no evidence of what had happened to her. The discovery beneath the drilling site seemed to validate those long-held suspicions. As Rebecca prepared for bed that night, she found herself thinking about her mother's last day in a way she hadn't allowed herself to do in years. Instead of focusing on the pain of loss, she tried to imagine what Beth might have encountered that final morning, what circumstances could have led to her death being buried so deep beneath the family land. The truth felt closer now than it had ever been, but it also felt more frightening than she had expected. The forensic archaeology team arrived at dawn, their white van and equipment trailer creating an oddly clinical presence against the rugged Montana landscape. Rebecca watched from her kitchen window as the specialists unloaded their gear, everything from fine brushes and measuring tools to heavy-duty sifting screens and photography equipment. The careful precision of their movements reminded her of the television crime shows she had watched obsessively in the months after her mother's disappearance, searching for clues about how real investigations worked. Dr. Patricia Wells, the lead forensic archaeologist, introduced herself to Rebecca with the kind of gentle professionalism that spoke of experience with grieving families. Wells explained that the excavation would proceed slowly, with every layer of soil carefully documented and examined for evidence. The process could take anywhere from 3 days to a week, depending on what they found and how well preserved any evidence might be after 9 years underground. Sheriff Hayes arrived shortly after the archaeology team began their preliminary work, bringing with him a manila folder that Rebecca recognized as her mother's case file. He had spent the previous evening reviewing every detail of the original investigation, looking for connections he might have missed as a young deputy. The file contained witness statements, search reports, and dozens of photographs from the weeks following Beth's disappearance, but no smoking gun that pointed toward foul play. The excavation began with the larger object, the one that radar had indicated was roughly truck-sized and buried deepest. Wells and her team marked out a precise grid over the area, dividing the dig site into manageable sections that could be systematically explored. Rebecca was surprised by how much the process resembled an archaeological dig at an ancient site, with the same attention to detail and careful documentation of every finding. As the first layers of soil were removed, Rebecca found herself thinking about the ranch's history and all the people who had worked this land over the decades. The Whitmore family had employed dozens of seasonal workers over the years, men who came and went with the changing demands of cattle ranching. Most had been reliable and trustworthy, but there had been a few who left under less than ideal circumstances, disputes over pay or concerns about their behavior around the livestock. Hayes asked Rebecca about any workers who might have had conflicts with her mother, particularly in the months before her disappearance. She struggled to remember specific incidents, but there had been one man the previous spring who Beth had fired for drinking on the job. Rebecca couldn't recall his name, but she remembered her mother mentioning that he had been angry about being let go, making vague threats about getting back at the family for what he saw as unfair treatment. The archaeology team worked methodically through the morning, photographing and cataloging every layer as they descended toward the metallic object. At a depth of 20 feet, they began finding small pieces of debris, fragments of glass and twisted metal that spoke of violent impact rather than careful burial. Wells called Hayes over to examine what appeared to be a piece of automotive trim, chrome-plated metal that had somehow survived nearly a decade underground. By early afternoon, the excavation had revealed enough of the buried object to confirm Hayes's growing suspicions. The outline emerging from the earth was unmistakably that of a vehicle, specifically a pickup truck buried nose down in what appeared to be a deliberately excavated hole. Rebecca felt her legs weaken as she stared at the partially exposed metal, painted in a faded blue color that looked disturbingly familiar. The blue paint beneath the layers of soil and sediment grew more distinct as the afternoon wore on, and Rebecca felt her heart sink with each careful brush stroke that revealed more of the buried vehicle. The color was wrong, completely wrong for what she had been expecting to find. Her mother's truck had been red, a bright cherry red Ford F-150 that had been found abandoned on the ranch road 9 years ago. This blue pickup emerging from the earth belonged to someone else entirely. Dr. Wells noticed Rebecca's confusion and called Sheriff Hayes over to explain what they were seeing. The archaeologist pointed out details that were becoming visible as more soil was cleared away, the distinctive styling and chrome trim that suggested the vehicle dated from the late 1980s or early 1990s. Most significantly, the truck appeared to have been buried deliberately rather than ending up underground through any kind of accident or natural process. Hayes studied the emerging vehicle with growing concern, his investigators' instincts telling him that they had stumbled onto something much larger than Beth Whitmore's disappearance. A truck buried this deep, and this deliberately suggested planning and resources that went far beyond a simple crime of passion. Someone had spent considerable time and effort to ensure that this vehicle would never be found, which raised disturbing questions about what else might be hidden on the ranch property. Rebecca asked to see the original case files again, specifically the witness statements from ranch workers who had been present during her mother's final weeks. Hayes spread the documents on a folding table near the excavation site, and together they reviewed the timeline of events leading up to Beth's disappearance. Most of the workers had been seasonal employees, men who came and went with the demands of cattle ranching, making them difficult to track down years later. One name caught Rebecca's attention as she scanned through the witness statements: a ranch hand named Danny Carpenter who had worked for the family during the summer of 2015 but had left abruptly in early September, several weeks before Beth vanished. According to the file, Carpenter had driven a blue pickup truck, an older model that matched the general description of what was being excavated from beneath the drilling site. Hayes immediately radioed for a background check on Danny Carpenter, requesting any information about his current whereabouts and his activities since leaving the Crawford Ranch. The coincidence of his blue truck and sudden departure seemed too significant to ignore, especially given the deliberate nature of the vehicle burial they were witnessing. Rebecca tried to remember details about Carpenter, but he had been one of many temporary workers who came and went during her college years. As the excavation continued, Dr. Wells made another disturbing discovery. The truck's windows appeared to be intact but heavily damaged, with spider web patterns of cracks that suggested impact from the inside rather than external pressure. More troubling still, the driver's side door was partially open, held in place by the compressed soil but clearly showing signs of hasty exit or struggle. The archaeology team worked with renewed urgency as the afternoon light began to fade, knowing that they needed to expose more of the vehicle before darkness forced them to stop for the day. Each shovelful of earth removed brought them closer to answers that had been buried for nearly a decade, but also closer to truths that Rebecca was beginning to fear she might not be prepared to face. Sheriff Hayes received the background check on Danny Carpenter just as the archaeological team was preparing to halt work for the evening. The information painted a troubling picture of a man with a history of violence and instability that had somehow escaped notice during the original investigation. Carpenter had been arrested twice in neighboring counties for assault, once involving a dispute with a former employer who had fired him for erratic behavior and suspected theft. More disturbing still, Carpenter had disappeared completely after leaving the Crawford Ranch in September 2015. He had failed to report to a court hearing related to one of his assault charges, and a warrant had been issued for his arrest that remained active. His last known address was a trailer park outside of Missoula, but when contacted, the landlord reported that Carpenter had abandoned the property without notice, leaving behind personal belongings and owing 3 months of back rent. Rebecca felt a chill as Hayes shared this information, realizing that a potentially dangerous man had been working on their property in the weeks before her mother's disappearance. She tried to remember any interactions she might have had with Carpenter during her brief visits home from college, but could only recall a vague impression of someone who made her uncomfortable without being able to articulate why. Dr. Wells announced that the excavation team would resume work at first light, but she had already seen enough to confirm that they were dealing with a crime scene rather than an accidental burial. The position of the truck, the damage patterns on the windows, and the way the vehicle had been placed in what appeared to be a pre-excavated hole all pointed toward deliberate concealment of evidence. Whatever had happened to Danny Carpenter, someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure his truck would never be found. As darkness fell over the ranch, Hayes posted additional security around the excavation site and arranged for floodlights to be brought in for the next day's work. He explained to Rebecca that they would need to expand the search area, using ground-penetrating radar to examine other sections of the property where vehicles or other evidence might be buried. The discovery of Carpenter's truck suggested that the ranch had been used as a dumping ground, possibly for multiple crimes spanning several years. Rebecca spent a sleepless night in the ranch house, her mind racing with possibilities she had never considered during the long years since her mother's disappearance. The official theory had always been that Beth suffered some kind of accident while working alone on the vast property, but the discovery of a deliberately buried truck suggested something far more sinister. Had her mother stumbled across evidence of Carpenter's crimes? Had she confronted him about something that led to violence? The next morning brought clear skies and the return of the archaeology team, along with additional equipment and personnel that Hayes had requested from the state crime lab. Rebecca watched from her kitchen window as the excavation resumed, each careful movement of soil bringing them closer to whatever secrets lay buried beneath the family land. She found herself praying that they would find answers, even as she feared what those answers might reveal about her mother's final hours. The expanded radar survey began immediately, with technicians methodically scanning areas throughout the ranch property where heavy equipment could have operated without being easily observed from the main road or ranch buildings. The ground-penetrating radar revealed 3 additional anomalies scattered across the ranch property, each showing the distinctive signature of metallic objects buried at significant depths. Dr. Wells studied the radar images with growing alarm, recognizing patterns that suggested a systematic operation rather than isolated incidents. The locations were strategically chosen, all in areas that would have been accessible to heavy machinery but hidden from casual observation by anyone passing through the ranch. Sheriff Hayes coordinated with the FBI field office in Billings, recognizing that the scope of what they had discovered exceeded the resources of his rural county. The federal agents arrived within hours, bringing specialized equipment and additional personnel trained in large-scale crime scene investigation. Rebecca found herself relegated to observer status as her family's property was transformed into the center of what appeared to be a major criminal investigation. The excavation of Danny Carpenter's truck continued under the supervision of the federal team, revealing more disturbing details with each layer of soil removed. The vehicle's bed contained what appeared to be personal belongings, clothing and tools that had been hastily thrown in before the truck was buried. Most significantly, forensic technicians discovered what looked like dried blood on the driver's seat and steering wheel, stains that had somehow survived 9 years underground. Rebecca watched the methodical work from a distance, her emotions swinging between hope for answers and dread about what those answers might reveal. The investigation had taken on a momentum of its own, with dozens of law enforcement personnel now working on the property where she had spent the happiest years of her childhood. The contrast between those innocent memories and the dark reality being unearthed felt almost unbearable. Agent Sarah Martinez, the FBI's lead investigator on the case, took time to brief Rebecca on what they had learned about Danny Carpenter's background. The man had a long history of moving from ranch to ranch across the western states, never staying in one place for more than a few months before disputes or suspicious circumstances forced him to leave. Several of his former employers had reported missing equipment or livestock after his departure, but none had pressed charges or reported their suspicions to law enforcement. The pattern suggested a predatory individual who targeted isolated rural properties where his activities were less likely to be detected or reported. Martinez explained that such criminals often escalated their behavior over time, moving from theft to more serious crimes when opportunity presented itself. The discovery of multiple burial sites on the Crawford Ranch suggested that Carpenter had found the perfect location for his activities, a vast property with areas that could be excavated and concealed without detection. As the afternoon progressed, the excavation team made a breakthrough in their work on Carpenter's truck. Dr. Wells called Martinez and Hayes over to examine what appeared to be human remains in the vehicle's cab, bones that had been preserved by the unique soil conditions at the burial depth. The discovery sent a wave of activity through the investigation team, with additional forensic specialists being called in to handle the delicate process of recovering and identifying the remains. Rebecca felt her knees weaken as she watched the careful extraction of bones from the buried truck, realizing that they had found evidence of murder rather than just concealment of stolen property. The remains appeared to be those of an adult male, roughly consistent with what would be expected from Danny Carpenter himself. But if Carpenter was dead, buried in his own truck, then who had killed him? And what connection did his death have to her mother's disappearance just weeks later? The implications were staggering and terrifying. Someone else had been operating on the ranch property, someone with the knowledge and resources to bury vehicles and eliminate threats. Rebecca found herself wondering if her mother had discovered Carpenter's body, if she had stumbled across evidence that led to her own death at the hands of whoever had killed the ranch hand. The forensic identification of Danny Carpenter's remains confirmed what Dr. Wells had suspected based on the dental records obtained from his previous arrests. The ranch hand had been dead for at least 9 years, killed by what appeared to be blunt force trauma to the skull before being buried with his truck in the deliberately excavated grave. The discovery transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a double homicide, with both Carpenter and Beth Whitmore likely victims of the same killer. Agent Martinez assembled a timeline of events based on the evidence they had gathered, working backward from Beth's disappearance in October 2015 to Carpenter's abrupt departure from the ranch several weeks earlier. The FBI's theory suggested that Carpenter had discovered something or someone on the Crawford Ranch that led to his murder, and that Beth had subsequently stumbled across evidence of that crime, sealing her own fate. Rebecca found herself thinking about Jake Morrison again, the reliable ranch hand who had worked alongside Carpenter during those final weeks. Jake had been present on the morning of her mother's disappearance, helping to load supplies for the cattle drive that Beth never completed. His sudden departure after Beth vanished had seemed strange at the time, but now it took on a more sinister significance. Had Jake been involved in Carpenter's death? Had he killed Beth to cover up his earlier crime? The second excavation site yielded disturbing results within hours of the team beginning their work. Ground-penetrating radar had indicated a metallic object buried at a depth similar to Carpenter's truck, and careful digging revealed what appeared to be farm equipment, specifically a large tractor that had been reported stolen from a neighboring ranch 3 years before Beth's disappearance. The theft had never been solved, with investigators assuming the expensive machinery had been transported out of state for resale. Martinez explained to Rebecca that the discovery of stolen equipment supported their theory about the ranch being used as a base for criminal operations. Someone had been using the vast, isolated property to hide evidence of various crimes, taking advantage of the fact that much of the land was rarely visited even by the Whitmore family. The perpetrator would have needed intimate knowledge of the ranch's layout and access to heavy equipment capable of digging the deep burial sites. Jake Morrison's background check revealed information that had been overlooked during the original investigation into Beth's disappearance. Morrison had previous experience operating heavy machinery, including bulldozers and excavators, skills he had developed during a stint working construction before transitioning to ranch work. More troubling still, he had left 2 previous ranch jobs under circumstances that his former employers described as sudden and unexplained. The FBI expanded their search to include Morrison's activities since leaving the Crawford Ranch, discovering that he had moved frequently across Montana and Wyoming, never staying in one place for more than a year. His pattern of behavior matched what criminal profilers recognized as the lifestyle of someone trying to stay ahead of law enforcement, constantly moving to avoid detection while continuing criminal activities. As darkness fell over the ranch for the second night of excavation, Rebecca realized that her childhood memories of Jake Morrison were being reframed in an entirely new and terrifying context. The man she had trusted, who had taught her to drive the ranch's stick-shift pickup and had helped her mother with countless tasks around the property, might have been a killer operating under their very noses. Agent Martinez received word that Jake Morrison had been located at a ranch outside of Casper, Wyoming, working under a slightly altered version of his real name. The FBI coordinated with local law enforcement to bring Morrison in for questioning, taking care to approach him quietly to avoid spooking him into flight. Rebecca felt a mixture of anticipation and dread as she waited for news, knowing that Morrison's arrest might finally provide answers to questions that had haunted her for nearly a decade. The third excavation site yielded the most disturbing discovery yet. Dr. Wells and her team uncovered what appeared to be a makeshift grave containing human remains, but these bones belonged to someone much smaller than either Carpenter or an adult victim. The forensic anthropologist's preliminary examination suggested the remains were those of a young person, possibly a teenager, who had been buried with considerably less care than the vehicles and equipment found at the other sites. Rebecca felt physically ill as she learned about the discovery, realizing that Jake Morrison's crimes might have extended far beyond theft and the murders of ranch workers. The presence of what appeared to be a juvenile victim suggested a level of depravity that made her mother's trust in Morrison seem tragically naive. How many people had died on the family property while she was away at college, completely unaware of the horror unfolding on her childhood home? Sheriff Hayes received the call from Wyoming just after noon, confirming that Morrison had been taken into custody without incident. The ranch where he had been working was being searched by federal agents, who had already discovered stolen equipment and documents that linked Morrison to crimes spanning multiple states over several years. Most significantly, they had found Beth Whitmore's missing truck, the red Ford F-150 that had been abandoned on the ranch road, now painted dark green and fitted with different license plates. The discovery of her mother's truck provided the final piece of evidence linking Morrison to Beth's murder. Martinez explained to Rebecca that Morrison had likely killed Beth when she discovered evidence of his criminal activities, then staged her disappearance to buy himself time to clean up and flee. The truck had been driven off the property and hidden at another location before eventually being transported to Wyoming, where Morrison apparently felt safe enough to use it as his personal vehicle. Morrison's interrogation began immediately, with FBI agents trained in extracting confessions from serial criminals leading the questioning. Rebecca was not permitted to observe the interview directly, but Martinez kept her informed about the major developments as they occurred. Morrison initially denied any involvement in the crimes, claiming he had simply been a ranch worker doing his job during his time at the Crawford property. The evidence against Morrison was overwhelming, however, and his fabricated alibis quickly crumbled under scrutiny. Faced with DNA evidence, stolen property in his possession, and witnesses who could place him at various crime scenes, Morrison's resistance began to weaken. Martinez explained that such criminals often reached a psychological breaking point when confronted with irrefutable proof of their guilt, especially when they realized that their carefully constructed lies were no longer believable. As evening approached, Rebecca found herself pacing the ranch house, unable to concentrate on anything except the interrogation taking place hundreds of miles away. After 9 years of wondering what had happened to her mother, the truth was finally being extracted from the man who had destroyed her family while pretending to be their trusted friend and helper. Jake Morrison's confession came in the early hours of the morning, delivered in a flat, emotionless voice that chilled even the experienced FBI agents conducting the interrogation. Agent Martinez called Rebecca at dawn to share the devastating details, her voice heavy with the weight of finally knowing the truth about Beth Whitmore's final day. Morrison had admitted to killing 4 people on the Crawford Ranch over a period of 3 years, using the isolated property as his personal hunting ground while maintaining the facade of a loyal ranch hand. The confession revealed that Morrison had initially come to the ranch with the intention of stealing equipment and cattle, but had discovered that the vast, rarely monitored property offered opportunities for far more serious crimes. Danny Carpenter had stumbled across Morrison burying stolen goods and had attempted to blackmail him, leading to Carpenter's murder in September 2015. The young victim found in the third grave was identified as a teenage runaway named Miguel Santos, who had been hitchhiking through the area and had the misfortune of accepting a ride from Morrison. Beth Whitmore's death had been different, Morrison claimed, almost defensive in his explanation to the FBI agents. He insisted that he had never intended to harm Beth, describing her as a good employer who had treated him fairly during his time on the ranch. But on the morning of October 15, 2015, Beth had discovered Morrison digging what she assumed was a grave for a sick calf in a remote section of the property. When she approached to offer help, she had seen Danny Carpenter's decomposing remains. Morrison's account of the confrontation painted Beth as brave to the end, demanding to know what had happened to Carpenter and threatening to call the police immediately. Morrison claimed he had tried to convince her that Carpenter's death was an accident, that he had been trying to cover up the ranch hand's accidental death to avoid involving law enforcement. But Beth was too intelligent and too familiar with ranch life to believe such an obvious lie. The murder itself had been brutal and swift, Morrison admitted. He had struck Beth with a shovel, the same tool he had been using to dig Carpenter's grave deeper to accommodate the truck burial. Beth had fallen immediately, her skull fractured by the blow, but Morrison claimed she had looked at him with such disappointment and sadness in her final moments that the image had haunted him ever since. Morrison had then faced the challenge of disposing of Beth's body in a way that would not immediately suggest murder. He had loaded her onto the back of an ATV and driven her to one of the ranch's remote canyons, where he had pushed her body into a deep crevice that he knew would be impossible for searchers to access safely. The red truck had been driven to the ranch road and abandoned to support the theory that Beth had suffered an accident while working alone. Rebecca listened to Martinez's recounting of Morrison's confession with tears streaming down her face, finally understanding the sequence of events that had destroyed her family. Her mother had died trying to do the right thing, attempting to seek justice for Danny Carpenter even when faced with a dangerous killer. Beth's courage and integrity had cost her life, but they had also led to Morrison eventually being held accountable for his crimes. The FBI was already organizing a recovery mission to the canyon where Morrison claimed to have disposed of Beth's remains, though the remote location and difficult terrain meant the search would be challenging and potentially dangerous. The search and rescue operation to recover Beth Whitmore's remains required specialized mountain rescue equipment and rappelling experts from the Montana National Guard. Rebecca insisted on being present during the recovery, despite Agent Martinez's concerns about the emotional toll of witnessing her mother's body being retrieved from the remote canyon. The location Morrison had described was nearly impossible to access safely, requiring a dangerous descent into a narrow crevice between towering rock walls. Technical rescue specialists spent 2 days establishing secure anchor points and safety systems before beginning the actual descent into the canyon. Rebecca watched from the rim as the team worked methodically, their voices echoing up from the depths as they navigated the treacherous terrain. The knowledge that her mother's body had been lying in this desolate place for 9 years, unreachable and alone, felt like a physical weight on Rebecca's chest. Dr. Wells supervised the recovery process, ensuring that Beth's remains were treated with the dignity and respect that had been denied her in death. The forensic anthropologist descended into the canyon with the rescue team, carefully documenting the position and condition of the bones before they were removed from their resting place. The dry climate and protected location had preserved the remains better than anyone had dared hope, allowing for a complete recovery. Sheriff Hayes stood beside Rebecca as the recovery proceeded, offering quiet support and answering her questions about the legal proceedings that would follow. Morrison had been charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and would likely face the death penalty or life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The physical evidence recovered from the ranch, combined with his detailed confession, made conviction virtually certain. The moment when Beth's remains were brought up from the canyon marked the end of nearly a decade of uncertainty for Rebecca. Seeing the careful way the rescue team handled the recovery bag containing her mother's bones, she felt a mixture of grief and relief that defied easy description. Beth was finally coming home, finally able to receive the proper burial that had been denied her for so long. Agent Martinez explained that the investigation would continue for several more weeks as authorities worked to identify any additional victims and recover stolen property that Morrison had hidden at various locations across multiple states. The scope of his criminal activities had surprised even experienced investigators, revealing a pattern of violence and theft that spanned at least 15 years and possibly dozens of victims. Rebecca made arrangements for her mother's funeral while the investigation continued around her, working with the local pastor to plan a service that would honor Beth's memory and provide closure for the community that had never stopped searching for answers. The small church where Beth had worshipped filled beyond capacity on the day of the service, with ranchers and townspeople traveling from across the region to pay their respects. Morrison was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole after pleading guilty to all charges in a plea agreement that spared Rebecca the trauma of a lengthy trial. He was transferred to a maximum security facility in another state, where he would spend the remainder of his life reflecting on the destruction he had caused to so many innocent families. 2 years after Jake Morrison's conviction, Rebecca Crawford stood in the same spot where the oil drilling equipment had first struck metal beneath the Montana soil. The excavation sites had been filled in and the land restored, but she could still see the subtle depressions where her family's property had yielded its terrible secrets. The ranch was hers again, the oil company having completed their extraction and departed, leaving her with mineral rights payments that would secure the property's future for generations to come. The transformation of the Crawford Ranch into the Beth Whitmore Memorial Foundation had taken 18 months of careful planning and legal work. Rebecca had donated half of the property to create a sanctuary for missing persons' families, a place where they could find support and resources while searching for their loved ones. The foundation also funded search and rescue operations in rural areas, ensuring that other families would not endure the decade of uncertainty that had defined Rebecca's young adulthood. Dr. Wells had remained involved with the foundation, serving as a forensic consultant and helping to establish protocols for investigating suspicious disappearances in remote areas. The discovery at the Crawford Ranch had led to changes in how law enforcement approached missing person cases on ranches and farms, with new emphasis on thorough background checks for temporary workers and better communication between agencies across state lines. Sheriff Hayes, now approaching retirement, often visited the ranch to check on Rebecca and to reflect on the case that had defined the latter part of his career. The success in solving Beth Whitmore's murder had brought national attention to his small department, but Hayes took no satisfaction in the recognition. He was haunted by the knowledge that more thorough investigation during the original case might have prevented other deaths, might have stopped Morrison before he killed again. Rebecca had found unexpected peace in the work of the foundation, channeling her grief into helping other families navigate the nightmare of having a loved one disappear without explanation. The residential program brought families to the ranch for weeks at a time, providing them with counseling, practical support, and access to resources that might help locate their missing relatives. Many of the families became lifelong friends, bound together by their shared experience of loss and hope. The memorial garden Rebecca had planted near the ranch house featured native Montana wildflowers and a simple stone bench where visitors could sit and remember their loved ones. Beth's grave was marked with a modest headstone that reflected her practical nature and deep love for the land. The inscription read simply, "Elizabeth Whitmore, 1973 to 2015, beloved mother and protector of this land." On quiet evenings, Rebecca would sit in the garden and remember her mother's strength and courage, qualities that had ultimately led to justice being served even at the cost of Beth's life. The foundation's work meant that Beth's death had meaning beyond the personal tragedy it represented, that her memory was helping other families find closure and peace. Morrison remained in prison, his appeals exhausted and his name forgotten by all except his victims' families. Rebecca had chosen never to visit him or communicate with him in any way, focusing instead on honoring her mother's memory through positive action rather than dwelling on the hatred she could have harbored for her mother's killer. The Crawford Ranch lived on, no longer just a cattle operation but a beacon of hope for families facing their darkest hours.